let's get started on the sacred in Native American religions. So just for continuity's sake, this is what we did last week. We talked about the nature of religion, understanding religion, various perspectives on religion, emphasizing awe and recognition. So the sense of religion being an experience of awe and fear, tremendous mystery and fascination, and at the same time, religion being a process by which you reconnect to the world after that dramatic experience. So it's one thing to have the experience, it's quite another to come back and reconnect, share it, and develop perhaps a religion based on it, is the way that often works. We talked about ways of misunderstanding, about the kind of religions are all the same idea, or religions are too different to even talk about. And we talked about ways forward through these lenses that we're using during our time together, the sacred, myth, ritual, community, and the individual. We talked about William James' wonderful definition of the belief that there's an unseen order and that somehow our supreme good lies in adjusting ourselves to that order. We talked about Paul Tillich's notion of religion as that which is of ultimate concern, and some others. So tonight, the sacred, and we're going to train our lens of the sacred on Native American religions. Now, you may have seen in the original flyer that we were going to talk about African religions tonight too. I decided, given last week the depth of the questions and the conversation we had, that we could go a little deeper and focus on Native American religions solely, because we can. So that was originally, the lectures were originally designed for about a 10,000-foot view. So we're going to bring it in a little bit to about a 5,000-foot view tonight. All right. So the sacred and the profane is a phrase that comes from one of the early scholars, prominent scholars of religion, Mircea Eliade. And he says, quite simply, the sacred is the opposite of the profane. Okay, good. It's a little more complex than that, but not too much more. The sacred is that which is the holy other that Rudolf Otto talked about. It's the unseen order that William James referenced. So anything that is not that is profane. Now, profane is a Latin word that simply means in front of the temple. So, right, again, pretty simple. So you have the sacred temple, and then you have the place that's not sacred, which is every other place starting right in front of it. That is, we have come to use profane to mean something more aggressive than that, but it's really not. It's really kind of a synonym for the mundane or the everyday. Eliade said that there is sacred space and sacred time. That's how we experience the sacred. Sacred space, accordingly, like the temple, is always marked. You're in sacred space right now. The University of Philosophical Research, the campus, is marked. We have walls, we have gates, we have buildings, and it looks different from its surroundings, right? There are often gates to sacred spaces, even if it's just an opening. You've got to mark the difference. So you've got to know when you're crossing the line from the profane or the everyday into the sacred. This can happen with natural phenomena like the Grand Canyon here. As I mentioned last time, a sacred space for me and for the Hopi and other people. There are all kinds of sacred spaces. They do not have to be religious in nature. In fact, they are more often than not perhaps natural phenomena, like the Grand Canyon, Devil's Tower for the Kiowa, well, just various places that now are often covered by churches, cathedrals, etc. So sacred space seems to be recognized no matter what people are recognizing. For example, the Kaaba in Mecca was most likely worshipped before the rise of Islam, because it's basically a meteorite, and it's pretty weird, and it's awesome, and that's what draws us to the sacred. We also have sacred time. And sacred time, again, the emphasis here is difference, radical difference. I think you all have probably experienced sacred time. It's different from the mundane. It is, for example, reversible. So, for example, to apply this to Native American religions, the Dene or the Navajo have a sand painting ritual that's a healing ritual. And it's very complex and elaborate, but basically the idea is to go back to creation. Well, yeah, you can go back to creation because sacred time is fluid. It's reversible. And of course, at creation, everything's okay. So if you can get back there, you're going to be okay. You get back there through the ritual. It does not flow. It's a whole different thing. Well, one of the writers I've written about, Leslie Marmon Silko, is Laguna Pueblo. She likes to call it time's burrito, because she said it's like a tortilla. Time is like a tortilla. You can just fold it over, and then these two events that are seemingly far apart now are right next to each other. So it does not flow. It's therefore kind of static, so it's a kind of eternal present, right? But it can also be cyclical, as in Hinduism, where things keep coming around, or in Friedrich Nietzsche's eternal return. So space-time, and now ecstasy. It's unfortunate to give this lecture these days, because ecstasy has a different meaning, or maybe not so different after all. But you have experienced sacred space, you've experienced sacred time, you've also experienced ecstasy. This is a Greek word with a prefix of ek, which means out, and stand, histanai, stand. To stand out. To stand out of what? To stand outside of oneself. You ever had that experience? Yeah, me too. This is the zone, if you play sports. You can hear Michael Jordan talking about the basket looking like a big bucket and feeling like everyone around him was moving in slow motion. Yep, that's what it looked like. Musicians. I mentioned before, I hack around on a guitar. I'm really bad, but I had a moment once, just once. And I don't know what happened, but I was kind of watching it, and it was awesome. I was ecstatic about it. I think mothers probably have this feeling, giving birth. Well, not all the time. Sometimes it hurts like hell, I'm sure. But, I mean, there's a kind of literalness there in giving birth, where you are standing outside of yourself, and new life is coming from you. What's that? Yes, artists, of course. I imagine Jackson Pollock in his studio, right, in the zone, standing outside of himself. It's often a technique in meditation to try to imagine yourself outside of yourself, looking back or down, right? This is actually a pretty powerful religious phenomenon, and it will happen to you whether you want it to or not sometimes. So for example, if you've ever been in a car wreck, time slows down, motion slows down, right? Have you experienced that? It's just like everything's so slow and you're like, like looking around. Now this is a car wreck and you're like, oh, that's going to happen, right? This is because time is a construct, but we'll get to that in a minute. So the sacred, what do we mean by the sacred? The sacred is ephemeral. It comes and goes. You cannot live in the sacred, according to Eliade and Otto and others. Because if you were living in the sacred, it would be mundane. There's no difference, right? There's no distinction. Eliade says that the sacred is about making a world. And sacred space, he says, is the axis mundi of the world, the center of the world. And we can see, if we look at cultures around the world, that the axis mundi is a very important concept. For the Hopi, for example, the Sipapu is a tiny little hole in the ground. For the Hopi, it's at the bottom of the Grand Canyon. This is the emergence place, right? This is where we entered this world from the third world or the fourth world, right? Sacred space. Eliade suggests that Aboriginals in Australia consider the sacred to be real and our mundane lives to be the illusion. So when you're in the dream time, that's when you're in the ultimately real. The rest of the time, you are in illusion. And it's not a very fun one, usually. All right, so that's the way that that comparative religion and the history of religions has looked at the sacred, being defined by Otto and Eliade in particular. But tonight we're doing Native American religions, and that does not apply. Remember last time we talked about the nature of religion being a sense of tension between what is and what ought to be, about the ideal and the real. With Native American religions, we don't have that. Let's talk about it. The history of Native American religions has been a history of misunderstanding. I'm sure you know this, and we could talk for hours about that, but just a brief rehearsal of some of this. Cristobal Colon, Christopher Columbus, this is what he said in his journal upon meeting the Arawak. They should be good and intelligent servants, for I see that they say very quickly everything that is said to them, and I believe they would become Christians very easily, for it seemed to me that they had no religion. Our Lord pleasing, at the time of my departure, I will take 6 of them from here to your highness, in order that they may learn to speak. No animal of any kind did I see on this island except parrots. I find that to be one of the most amazing paragraphs in the history of the world. And it says a lot about Europe and Western culture. And I don't know why, I don't think this is intentional, this notion of repeating everything that is said to them and then finishing with, all I see are parrots. I don't know, maybe just a historical irony, I don't know. But this defined the relationship between Europe and Native America to this day. They had no religion, therefore they should be good and intelligent servants, and I will take them. I mentioned last time the story from Charles Eastman's The Soul of the Indian that we're going to come back to when we talk about myth, of the missionary who came to the Seneca and gave them the gospel of Jesus Christ, and they responded with the story about the origin of corn. And the missionary is angered and says, what I gave you were sacred truths, and you've given me back fable and falsehood. And the Seneca are genuinely confused and say, we believed your story, why won't you believe ours? That's a fundamental difference in the way of not just looking at the world, but being in the world, right? William Penn, I think I mentioned this last time. The great William Penn, a fantastic, brilliant, compassionate Quaker, trying to figure out where his friends belonged in his universe, concluded that they were clearly not Christian. They didn't seem to worship the devil, therefore they must be Jews. Anthropologists, Native American history is rife with anthropologist stories. One of my favorites is, this is late 19th century, I believe it was the Navajo, the Dene, and anthropologist goes, because this early 20th century, late 19th century is the time when anthropology changed with Franz Boas, but we won't get into that. But they're trying to do more than record. They're trying to kind of save these cultures. So they go, the anthropologist goes to the Navajo and says, you know, you have to plow in the spring. And the Navajo are horrified and say, no, you can't cut Mother Earth open in the spring. What kind of monster are you? And the anthropologist, being a good scientist, says, are you saying if I jump up and down on the ground right now here in the spring that the plants won't come? The harvest won't happen? No, they say, but it sure would tell us what kind of person you are. Missionaries, lots of missionary stories, the black robes in Canada and New England. Of course, we know this here in California, the missionaries and the establishment of the missions. Wounded Knee. Again, we could talk hours about these individual instances, but they are a continuum. The Ghost Dance, and now Standing Rock in North Dakota. How do these differences arise? Here I want to introduce you to one of the greatest religious thinkers of our time. His name is Vine Deloria Jr. He was an Oglala Sioux, and he was also a lawyer, a seminarian, and an incredibly brilliant and widely read man. I always smile when I think of Vine Deloria because I saw him a few times at the American Academy of Religion meetings, and people would be out in the hallway to hear him speak because he was so smart. And he was a trickster, basically. He would mess with people mercilessly, especially academic types who thought they knew something about Native American religion or anything, really. I'll never forget standing along the wall in this auditorium because it was so packed. And he was on a panel with a theologian from a Catholic university. I don't remember, excuse me, which one. And of course, they were talking about land rights, treaty rights, etc. And the theologian gave a very nice disposition on the problems of native land rights in the contemporary United States. Vine turned to him and said, I would think this would be easy for a Catholic. If you steal something, you give it back. Poor guy. He had nothing to say because there is nothing to say. In this book, God is Red, there is a crucial chapter called Thinking in Time and Space. And it's the pivot on which the whole book turns. And his contention is that the differences between native religions and Euro-American or Western religions is that native religions are based on space, in particular place. Euro-American and Western religions are based on time. Stop and think about that a second. It's taken me a while to get this as I've taught this book because I'm in the time worldview, right? And so are you. Having a worldview based on time generates a sense of linearity, obviously, but more than that, it generates a sense of revelation that at a point in time, the unseen order, William James's unseen order, Rudolf Otto's holy other, breaks through into time, right? Well, what are you going to do with that? You're going to mark it. You're going to celebrate it. You're going to derive a religion from it. Okay, fair enough. Now, I should say before I go on, Deloria is not setting up a binary here. He's not doing that. He's not saying native peoples solely live in space, space-based thinking, and don't deal with time. This is more of a continuum. It's not a binary. So let me show you. Well, let me keep going here. If you have linearity and revelation breaks through, you also get a sense of destiny, right? That word have any echoes for you in regard to Native American history? The destiny is manifest, right? It's pretty clear. Think about this. Time assumes the transportability of the sacred. Think about that. The transportability of the sacred. And so Muhammad has a revelation in what is now Saudi Arabia, and we can lift that from that place and transport it to Europe, Africa, the United States, everywhere. It is transportable. Well, once you lift it from space or place, it also becomes universal. Why? Because there's only one time. There are many places. There is only one time. And so if your revelation is in history, then it has to be better than someone else's revelation in history, right? As opposed to a sense of space or place where the sacred is here. It's here. It's at Devil's Tower for the Kiowa. It's at the Sipapu for the Hopi. It's in the Black Hills for the Sioux. It's in Blue Lake for the Taos Pueblo. Okay, if that's the case, I don't need to go anywhere. Why would I go anywhere? It's not transportable. It's not universal because the space itself is not universal. You see? Stay with me here. Deloria also talks about how time is disorienting. Excuse me. Time is disorienting. We kind of talked about that already, how time is a construct. It flows differently at different times. So, for example, we think of clock time, and we use clock time, but that's not what we experience. Because it was like a couple years ago I got my Ph.D. It wasn't 30 years ago. That's not what it feels like. It wasn't 5 years ago that I moved to Los Angeles. It was last year, wasn't it? Right? You know what shapes the flow of time? Emotion, right? other experiences, maybe even experiences of place, right? So I've driven across the country probably 24 times, completely different flow. I had no place to be, and so time kind of slowed down, even stopped. This gets carried over, or not carried over, but this gets articulated among Native peoples, where there's no January. January, what's January? Janus? I don't know Janus. What, some Roman god or something? It's abstract. It's completely abstract. All right, we'll call it January, or October, or November. Sure, we'll call it that. Among the Plains tribes, for example, January is the moon of the popping trees. It's experiential, right? It's so cold that the trees pop. Oh, I know January on the plains. Yeah, I can feel it right now. It's so cold, right? So it's abstract versus experiential. And finally, these are Gloria's arguments. Time consumes space. This is a hard one. How does time consume space? Well, you have to understand what all he's talking about that goes into time, that is ideology, notions of your place in time, to kind of mix our metaphors there, where you exist in time. For Western culture, we exist in time. That means we have beginnings, we have endings, and we have a path from one to the other. Okay? If you are spatially based, time, it's secondary. Not that big a deal. There's, again, Leslie Marmon Silko, I think I mentioned earlier. She has a novel called Almanac of the Dead. It's 760 pages of legal indictment against the United States on behalf of Native cultures. It is some of the most horrific stuff I've read in fiction, and I read a lot of dark fiction. Again, 760 pages. I'm going to spoil it for you a little bit so you don't have to go through the 760 pages of horror. The main character is Sterling. He's a Laguna Pueblo, and he just wants to put the world right. He wants to bring back some balance to this nightmare. And so, as a good novelist, Silko plots for him to be at a certain place at a certain time, and good readers, time-based readers, we know, here's the climax of the story. And the line is, well, might take 500 years. Wait, what? It might take what? Sterling's going to be dead by then. But no, it might take 500 years. That's okay. Earth will still be here. Earth's more important than we are, right? So I've been thinking more about this notion of time and space and how time consumes space. And I remembered being in Atlanta doing my doctorate. If you've been to Atlanta, you may have been to Stone Mountain, Georgia. Anybody ever heard of this? Oh, okay. I love telling people in LA what it's like to live in the South. You will not believe this, or maybe you will. Stone Mountain, Georgia is this massive granite mountain. And into the side of it is carved 4 Confederate generals on their horses. It's called the Mount Rushmore of the South. I was there for, I think, 4th of July or some event. I was dragged to it. I did not want to be there. I remember that. But I was amazed because here it was in a patriotic frenzy, and they had a laser light show. And so I kid you not, they lit up the Confederate generals. I think it was Jefferson Davis, it's always Robert E. Lee, and some others. And the horses started trotting I was just dumbfounded. And then they projected a map of the United States, and starting on the eastern seacoast, a growth began, and it moved westward. I thought, that's how time consumes space. It literally does. And so I don't have the Stone Mountain video for you, but I do have this to just give you a sense. This is it starts at 1776. Of course, a lot happened before that, but this will give you a sense of time consuming space. Here's some words from God is Red that I wanted you to hear from Vine Deloria. American Indians hold their lands, places, as having the highest possible meaning. It's another word for the sacred, right? And all their statements are made with this reference point in mind. Immigrants, he means you and me, by the way. Immigrants review the movement of their ancestors across the continent as a steady progression of basically good events and experiences, thereby placing history, time, in the best possible light. I also found this interesting. This was written in 1973. It was updated slightly in 1992. Vine Deloria died a few years ago. But 1973, he says this: in a world in which communications are nearly instantaneous and simultaneous experiences are possible, it must be space that in a fundamental way distinguishes us from one another, not time. All right, wrapping up here. Deloria says temporally based religions, that is, most Western religions, all Western religions, are on the defensive because time keeps moving, right? I remember my friend Rabbi David Balinson taking students to his temple, and the prayer being, "Oh God, teach us how to make sense of your words from 3,000 years ago in a desert to here, now, today." There's the problem, right? You've lifted the sacred from its place, and now you've put it in Alabama. Okay? What are you going to do about that? How are you going to make sense of that, right? There's an inherent judgment of other religions because, I mean, he's not saying that they all do it, but he's saying that it's there. The possibility is there. Why? Because there's one time. You don't get to, there's not different times in which Christianity does this and Islam does that. It's all the same time. And so there's an inherent judgment involved because you're competing in the same, I almost said space, but you know what I mean. There's an inherent judgment of a behavior against a past norm, right? Because the past, in religion, the past is always better in temporally based religions, right? It was creation, then it was fall. And we've never recovered from our fall. And in fact, the only way to get out of this is to kind of create a new heaven and a new earth, right? We don't get to go back. We have to create a new heaven because time keeps flowing relentlessly, right? Temporally based religions are portable. For good or ill, they're portable. You can move them around, right? And there's probably no better example of that than the United States right now, where I should do just a little book or something on the conversations I have with Uber and Lyft drivers coming to the University of Philosophical Research. I swear, and it happened tonight. So a nice young man picks me up. He's talking about his 2-month-old child. He looks at the destination and he says, University of Philosophical Research, what's that? Oh, well, I'm giving a lecture there on the sacred in Native American religions. Are you going to talk about shamanism? Okay, I could. Oh, you know about shamanism? I'm Mongolian. I came here 5 years ago from Mongolia. We know all about shamanism. Everybody goes to a shaman in Mongolia. I'm like, really? So he's telling me all about his experience with the shaman in Mongolia, and he's saying, you need to talk about that. Well, I'm not prepared to talk about it. But he was asking me, well, how's that different in Native American religions? Which Mongolian seems to be about divination more, like telling the future, but not in a superficial way, just like, what should you do? It's got an ethical component. I said, well, it's mostly healing. Shamans are often called medicine men and women. Oh, yeah, we don't do that. So, the religions, if they're temporally based, are portable and they are powerful. I don't think I need to make that point, do I? We saw the animation. You can pick up any paper and know that temporally based religions are powerful. Spatially based religions have a rootedness to them, obviously, so that when Geronimo and his band, Goyathle was his actual name, when his band of Apache are captured and moved to Florida, they don't last a year because they belong in the Sonoran Desert, not in Florida. Does anybody belong in Florida? I'm just kidding. Again, this is Deloria. In a spatially based religion, there's no need for preaching or teaching because it's all right there, right? Devil's Tower is right there. Blue Lake is right there. We don't need reminding. We are living in it, in the sacred, right? Every day. And everything is sacred, unlike Eliade, see? There's a book called Lame Deer, Seeker of Visions, you may have heard of. And there's a great scene where Lame Deer is cooking a stew. And it goes on for like an hour about what the stew means, right? Because it's just overflowing with meaning. Everything is overflowing with meaning because the sacred is always present. So there's no real profane. Ethics become indistinguishable from just custom. This is what we do. This is how we make stew. We honor where the stew came from. We recognize that there are forces larger than us that brought us this stew. Interestingly, there are no golden ages or utopias in a spatially based religion. Think about what it would be like to live without this sense of a perfect past or a perfect future and being in this middle trough where everything's terrible. You don't have to live like that. Humans don't have to, and haven't lived like that always. But of course, these spatially based religions are incredibly vulnerable, right, to missionary colonial appropriation activity because they can't leave. And when they're forced to leave, they're lost, right? So it's incredibly fragile. Yeah. Leslie Marmon Silko wrote a book called The Delicacy and Strength of Lace. And one of her prominent metaphors is a spider web. Spider web's very strong, but not in the face of certain forces, right? All right, so wrapping up, and then we're going to talk. The sacred in Native American religions is about what? It's about community. We're going to talk more about this because I think Vine Deloria missed something that is important. We'll talk about this when it comes to myth, especially myth in Christianity, and that is the difference between orality, speaking only, and literacy, that is writing and print. But both orality and spatially based worldviews produce community. Just for example, in an oral culture, you don't get to send an email. You don't get to send a letter. If you're going to share something, you have to be present, right? All right. Resistance. This is commonly overlooked in our general understanding of Native American cultures, is that there's no resistance. There is. There has been all along. And it's only recently that this has come into the mainstream news with Standing Rock. Think about Standing Rock and the protests there against the Dakota Pipeline with this understanding, with Vine Deloria's understanding of the sacred as space, right? So it's not about a political point. It's about life and death. It's about water, right? And poisoning water. It's about the relatives, the ancestors, and where they live, and the spirits, and where they live. All right, I got to stop. Humor. I was at a Native American literature conference in Minnesota on the res. So we met in a casino, and it was great. We had all these professors talking about Native American literature. And so I went to this session, and it was on cannibalism. And I went because what are we doing? Talking about cannibalism. So I went just to see what was going on. And it was weird. But there was a Native woman who sat next to me. And then there was a younger scholar up there who was clearly out of place, not just in terms of being younger, but her topic had nothing to do with representations of cannibalism in history and literature. And finally somebody said, Dr. So-and-so, can I ask what your paper has to do with any of this? And she's like, I have no idea. They just stuck me in this panel, and she's clearly upset. So the Native woman next to me says, well, I know, I'm sorry, I broke the joke. The panel was on humor in Native American literature, and they started talking about cannibalism. And so the Native woman said to this young scholar, said, well, I think what you're calling here is to find the humor in cannibalism. Nobody laughed. I'm about to crack up. And I got on the elevator with her, and I said, the humor in cannibalism, really? She's like, I was trying to help. Vine Deloria himself, this is a joke, God is Red, 1972. What's it a play on? Thomas Altiser's 1967, God is Dead, right? Some of his other books are called Custard Died for Your Sins, Red Earth, White Lies. This is a powerful weapon in the Native community, is humor. And you can see it in the literature, but also everywhere. I follow some Standing Rock people on Twitter. It's pretty funny. It's deadly serious and absolutely hilarious, like cannibalism. Storytelling, of course, still going on, still vital, still holding things together. In fact, Sherman Alexie is a very interesting, funny, and powerful Native American writer. I don't know if you know his work. Speaking of humor, his most famous book is called The Lone Ranger and Tonto Fist Fight in Heaven. If you know the film, what? No, I'm sorry, no, not that film. There was a film made of the Smoke Signals. If you know the film Smoke Signals, yeah, it was an indie art thing. It's based on his book. Anyway, in his literature, he has a couple of places where he says, sometimes he says, and he writes it out like this, like a formula, survival equals anger times the imagination. And sometimes he writes, literature equals anger times the imagination. Yeah? And then finally, reconciliation. This is a poem by a Muskogee Creek poet named Joy Harjo. And it says more about Native American religions than I could ever tell you. So I just want to read it to you, then we'll be done, okay? We gather by the shore of all knowledge as peoples who were put here by a God who wanted relatives. This God was lonely for touch and imagined herself as a woman with children to suckle, to sing with, to continue the web of the terrifyingly beautiful cosmos of her womb. This God became a father who wished for others to walk beside him in the belly of creation. This God laughed and cried with us as a sister at the sweet tragedy of our predicament, foolish humans. Or built a fire as a brother to keep us warm. This God who grew to love us became our lover, sharing tables of food enough for everyone in this whole world. Oh, sun, moon, stars, our other relatives peering at us from the inside of God's house, walk with us as we climb into the next century, naked but for the stories we have of each other. Keep us from giving up in this land of nightmares that is also the land of miracles. We sing our song, which we've been promised has no beginning or end. All acts of kindness are lights in the war for justice. We gather up these strands broken from the web of life. They shiver with our love as we call them the names of our relatives and carry them to our home, made of the four directions, and sing. Of the South, where we feasted and were given new clothes. Of the West, where we gave up the best of us to the stars as food for the battle. Of the North, where we cried because we were forsaken by our dreams. Of the East, because returned to us is the spirit of all that we love. All right. Sorry to go so long, but let's talk.